Imagine a modern army that needs to transport 50,000 troops over a distance of 1,500 kilometers. Today, that would require trains, transport planes, hundreds of trucks, and months of meticulous planning. Now remove internal combustion engines, electricity, and even basic radio communication from that equation. Welcome to ancient Rome, where generals tackled such insane logistical challenges with frightening regularity. The Roman war machine moved massive numbers of people so quickly that enemies simply refused to believe their eyes. And they did it with an invisible supply system that won wars before the first sword was even drawn. It seems incredible that people in simple sandals could outpace modern motorized convoys over rough terrain. But this is where it gets interesting, because the secret lies not in magic, but in ruthless Roman discipline. Imperial commanders understood a simple truth: the outcome of a battle is decided not by heroic duels, but by mundane supply lines. While the barbarians were still gathering into a disorganized mob, the legions were already marching toward them along perfectly level highways. In this scenario, we'll break down the anatomy of a Roman march and understand how this ancient logistical network worked. Spoiler, your shoulders and legs will start to ache just from listing these insane daily workloads. We've all heard the famous saying that all roads lead to Rome. It sounds like a beautiful metaphor for tourists, but in reality, it was a harsh and pragmatic military fact. The Romans didn't build their transportation network to make it easier for merchants to transport wine and olive oil. These stone arteries were created with a single purpose: to move legions as quickly as possible to the site of the next uprising. In essence, they were ancient military highways, laid through deadly swamps, high mountains, and dense forests. Without these roads, the empire would have fallen apart in the very first decades of its aggressive expansion. The Romans' engineering approach to construction caused a nervous tick in all the unprepared neighboring peoples and tribes. Instead of carefully skirting obstacles along natural paths, they preferred to cut straight through them. If a massive rock stood in their way, the legionnaires would simply take heavy pickaxes and methodically cut a tunnel through it. If a wide river blocked the path, they would build a bridge for heavy cavalry in a matter of days. Modern engineers spend years coordinating projects, while the Romans simply arrived and drastically altered the local landscape. The irony is that some of these bridges are still used by modern European motorists. Road construction was an incredibly labor-intensive process that fell entirely on the shoulders of the exhausted soldiers themselves. First, military engineers dug a deep trench to ensure they reached the hardest layer of soil. Then the multi-layered paving began. Large stones, sand, fine gravel, and perfectly fitted basalt slabs on top. The result was a kind of layered cushion that didn't give way under the feet of tens of thousands of people and the hooves of horses. The roads were made slightly convex in the center so that cold rainwater would always flow to the deep shoulders. It sounds like a basic rule of modern asphalt paving, but the Romans figured this out more than 2,000 years ago. The scale of this stone transportation network truly astounds even the boldest modern imagination of historians. By the time the empire reached its zenith, the legions had laid more than 80,000 kilometers of roads with a reliable, solid surface. This gigantic distance would be quite enough to circle the globe twice along the equator without a single stop. No other civilization of the ancient world could boast even a tenth of such infrastructure projects. Barbarians often tried to use these roads for their raids, but it was frankly a bad idea. After all, the enraged owners of these stone highways were already racing toward them at incredible speed along the very same routes. The speed of travel on such roads radically changed all the existing rules of the brutal wars of that time. A typical army of that era trudged through the mud at a speed of about 15 kilometers in an endlessly long day. A Roman legion on the march along its road easily covered 30 kilometers, and if necessary, made a forced march. To the ancient world, this seemed like magic. You'd barely heard word of the enemy's advance, and they were already there. Imagine the face of a Gallic chieftain who genuinely believed he had a whole month to prepare. Yet the Romans were brazenly knocking on his gates just a week and a half later, fully prepared for a massive siege. But it gets even more interesting here, because the roads required constant maintenance and reliable military protection. The Romans didn't just mindlessly throw stones into the ground. They built a full-fledged and well-thought-out infrastructure along the routes. Every 15 kilometers, there were special stations where couriers could quickly change out tired horses. This allowed urgent military dispatches to be transmitted over vast distances at a speed of 200 kilometers per day. Your modern package from an online store sometimes takes longer to arrive than it did for a Roman emperor to receive news from the front. Thanks to this system, the ancient command always knew exactly where each specific legion was located. Of course, marching for long periods on hard stone in leather sandals was quite a trial for the feet. The footwear of Roman legionaries, known as caligae, was densely studded with iron nails for good traction. The sound of a marching legion resembled the clanging of an approaching metal conveyor belt and struck wild terror into the hearts of local residents. But those very same nails transmitted all the hardness of the stone slabs directly into the joints of the poor, exhausted soldiers. Doctors of the time were constantly treating broken feet, heels worn down to the bone, and severely inflamed knees. My feet start to ache just from the thought of what it must be like to walk 1,000 kilometers on foot. However, it was precisely this pain and the incredible hardness of the pavement that made the Roman army an absolutely invincible machine. High-quality roads allowed generals to remain independent of the whims of the weather, which often halted less organized armies. While the Celts or the wild Germanic tribes got hopelessly bogged down in the autumn mud, the legions continued their relentless march. Pouring rain might soak the soldiers to the skin, but it could not slow their rhythmic, iron-like march. The Roman command loved to deliver crushing blows precisely when the enemy considered troop movement impossible. And every time, the enemies realized with chilling horror that for Rome, the concept of bad weather simply did not exist. It is important to understand that the constant construction of roads was an excellent way to keep soldiers occupied during rare periods of peace. Experienced generals knew full well that a bored army very quickly turns into a mob of dangerous and defiant rebels. Therefore, as soon as a bloody campaign ended, the legionnaires were immediately handed shovels and sent to mix concrete. The soldiers openly hated this grueling work and often wrote plaintive letters home on wooden tablets. But it was precisely this hard daily labor that kept them in phenomenal physical shape all year round. In essence, it was a massive construction corporation that spent its free time conquering neighboring countries. Ultimately, the roads became the very secret weapon that firmly united the scattered lands. They transformed the primitive chaos of the wild territories into a unified mechanism that unquestioningly obeyed the will of the Roman Senate. It is absolutely impossible to control a vast empire if it takes 6 months to reach its outskirts, wading knee-deep in mud. Ancient engineers solved this problem once and for all by paving an entire continent with solid stone and then with their own citizens. And even today, as you drive along Europe's modern toll roads, you often follow the route of the ancient legions. They left their deep mark on history not only with sharp swords, but also with the perfect geometry of their roads. Every legionnaire on a long march quickly turned into something resembling a heavily laden and very angry mule. The command had long decided that huge supply trains slowed down the march, so soldiers were required to carry their own gear. The standard weight of military equipment and field rations was about 30 kilograms per person. This necessarily included weapons, heavy armor, personal belongings, construction tools, and a 3-day supply of food. Modern special forces also carry heavy backpacks, but theirs have ergonomic straps and anatomical support. The Romans, however, hauled all this gear on a long wooden pole that pressed painfully and agonizingly against their shoulders. Maintaining the correct pace was a true religion for the commanders of any self-respecting Roman unit. The army moved at a speed of exactly 100 steps per minute, set by rhythmic beats and the sounds of trumpets. This created a hypnotic effect that helped the soldiers fall into a light trance and forget the excruciating pain. If anyone lost their step or began to lag behind, they immediately received a harsh blow with a stick from the centurion. No unscheduled stops to drink some water or fix a sandal were strictly forbidden by the regulations. You either kept pace with the entire invincible empire, or you were left to die on the sidelines of history. To endure such inhuman demands, the legions constantly underwent brutal training during peacetime. Recruits were forced to march 30 kilometers 3 times a week in full combat gear. Why torment people who were already constantly in military service and risking their lives? Because the generals knew, in a real war, the ability to march for long distances is far more important than the ability to swing a sword gracefully. The soldiers' cardiovascular systems adapted to constant stress, turning them into incredibly resilient machines. Modern sports doctors call this forced adaptation, but the Romans simply called it a regular Tuesday. Discipline on the march was maintained by the harshest yet most effective methods possible. The columns stretched for kilometers, and any chaos could lead to a fatal delay for the entire military corps. For attempting to discard heavy equipment to lighten their load, soldiers could be publicly flogged in front of the entire formation. Sleeping during a brief rest period while on combat duty was punishable by immediate execution without trial. It sounds like sheer madness, but it was precisely this fear of punishment that drove men to achieve the impossible. They feared their strict commanders far more than any savage barbarians with their long swords. It's interesting to compare the endurance of these ancient warriors with that of modern professional soldiers. These days, infantry rarely march more than 20 kilometers without significant armored support. A Roman legion consistently covered 30 kilometers a day for weeks on end and then immediately engaged in fierce combat. They couldn't call in an evacuation helicopter if someone twisted an ankle or suffered heat stroke. All you could do was grit your teeth, lean on a comrade's shoulder, and keep marching forward endlessly. By the standards of the ancient world, these men were true cyborgs of flesh, blood, and sheer hatred. The psychological effect of such incredible speed was simply devastating to the enemy. Imagine your spies reporting, "The Roman army is 300 kilometers from your capital." You logically assume you have at least 2 or 3 weeks to muster a militia and fortify the walls. But 10 days later, neat rows of gleaming helmets and red shields are already appearing on the horizon. This mobility broke the enemy's will even before the first deadly arrow took flight. Victory went to whoever dictated their terms on the battlefield faster, and the Romans were always the first to arrive. The order of formation on the march was thought out down to the tiniest and most tedious logistical details. Scouts and light cavalry always led the way to rule out the possibility of a sudden ambush in the forest. Behind them moved the legion's elite and sappers, who repaired bridges or cleared large obstructions on the move. Only then did the main body of the infantry follow, and at the very rear trailed the supply train with heavy siege weapons. If the column came under attack from the flank, the soldiers had just a couple of minutes to deploy into battle formation. This was not merely a march of a disorganized crowd, it was a massive, spear-bristling centipede on the move. A unique system of camaraderie, built into the very structure of the army, helped them cope with accumulated fatigue. Legionnaires lived, ate, and marched in small groups of 8, called contubernia. If one of the comrades began to falter from exhaustion, the others would quietly take over part of his heavy load. They understood perfectly well that in the coming battle, each man's life depended directly on the person standing next to him. This ancient form of team building worked far better than any modern corporate training in an office. You wouldn't abandon someone with whom you've shared a single tent and a single pot of porridge for 10 long years. Of course, the massive army always encountered the most unexpected and unpleasant natural obstacles along the way. A wide river without a ford could halt the advance of any other troops for long and agonizing weeks, but the Romans always carried ropes, clamps, and detailed instructions for quickly assembling pontoon bridges. Engineering units literally cut down trees on the go and tied together floating platforms to transport heavy equipment across the water. Soldiers crossed the water barrier without slowing down and immediately burned the bridge behind them. They dealt with terrain challenges as casually as we deal with traffic jams on a GPS today. The Legion's arrival at its destination always signaled the start of a new, even more arduous phase of work. Do you think that after a 30-kilometer march in the heat, they were given time to lie down on the grass and rest? Not a chance, because they had to turn a bare field into an impregnable military base in just a few hours. Feet rubbed raw and bleeding were no excuse for refusing to dig a deep defensive trench. But we'll discuss this sophisticated torment of the human body in detail in the next chapter of our story. For now, just remember, a Roman soldier rested only when he was in complete and absolute safety. Feeding 50,000 healthy, physically active men in the field is a truly titanic task. This is the population of a small modern city, burning thousands of calories daily on grueling marches. They required about 70 tons of food every day, simply to avoid dying of plain old exhaustion. Add to that thousands of horses and mules, which required enormous amounts of fodder and fresh water. Any other army would have quickly devoured all the local supplies and shamefully scattered home in hunger. But the Empire's logistical machine ran like a flawless clockwork mechanism, allowing for no breakdowns. To grasp the scale of this, one must imagine the daily hardships of a Roman legionary. These men did not simply march along the road with their belongings. Every evening, they built a fortified camp with deep ditches and high defensive ramparts. Such earthworks required a colossal amount of energy and strength. Therefore, each soldier needed about 3 kilograms of nutritious food daily. Only a brilliant army supply system could ensure such a steady flow of calories. The concept of a supply train in the Roman army differed greatly from the common perception of cumbersome carts. Generals sincerely hated long caravans laden with bulky supplies. They made the army too vulnerable to the enemy's swift guerrilla attacks. Therefore, the Romans developed a flexible system of echelon troop supply. It always moved strictly parallel to the main forces of heavily armed infantry. This helped avoid sudden ambushes on narrow forest roads and mountain passes. Logisticians tried to transport heavy loads on spacious river barges. They also actively used merchant ships if the military campaign took place along the coastline. Water transport allowed for the movement of hundreds of tons of grain with minimal physical effort. Only the most essential and urgent supplies for the soldiers were transported overland. These were skillfully distributed among thousands of hardy pack mules. This allowed the legions to maintain their mobility and avoid becoming easy targets for mounted archers. By requiring soldiers to carry part of their rations on their own backs, the command solved several critical problems at once. First, this drastically reduced the number of animals in the military supply train. After all, every horse or mule also had to be fed constantly. Second, soldiers were able to sustain themselves for about 3 days in the event of unforeseen delays. Each legionnaire carefully kept a sacred supply of hard grain and crackers in his bag. Losing this supply was considered a serious military offense, for which one was severely punished in front of the entire formation. For such incredible endurance and the ability to carry enormous weights, the legionnaires were often called Marius's mules. This nickname originated in honor of the commander Gaius Marius, who had introduced these harsh rules. In addition to food, soldiers carried a mess kit, a canteen, a sickle for harvesting, and entrenching tools. The weight of all this equipment could easily reach 30 kilograms. However, such a load gave the units unprecedented tactical independence from supply wagons. Autonomy was the key to survival, far from the safe and warm imperial borders. The staple of the Iron Legionnaire's diet was ordinary grain, not roasted meat, as many mistakenly believe. Meat in the Roman army was considered more of a supplement to the main course. Sometimes an abundance of meat was even seen as a sure sign of a dire situation with normal supplies. Commanders quickly noticed a decline in soldiers' endurance on a high-protein diet during long marches. Complex carbohydrates from wheat provided energy slowly and as evenly as possible. Ancient military leaders simply discovered the principle of carb loading 2 millennia before the advent of fitness trainers. Cheese, olive oil, and a little salt added a pleasant variety to this strict carbohydrate diet. Salt was generally considered a strategic commodity of immense importance for survival. Without it, the human body quickly lost water and grew catastrophically weak under the scorching summer sun. Oil was used not only as a high-calorie food supplement, but also for personal hygiene. Cheese provided the necessary calcium and could be stored for months without losing quality. All these simple foods were ideally suited to the harsh conditions of ancient military campaigns. These rugged warriors drank a rather strange beverage called posca. It consisted of plain water and cheap sour vinegar. To modern ears, this sounds disgusting and is more reminiscent of spoiled Greek salad dressing. But in conditions of complete unsanitary conditions, it was a brilliant way to disinfect water from any dirty puddle. The acid reliably killed bacteria, and the drink itself perfectly quenched thirst and replenished electrolytes lost through sweat. In essence, it was an ancient energy drink that allowed the body to perform at its peak. The consumption of posky firmly united the army from the lowest ranks to the highest military command. Even the famous Julius Caesar demonstratively drank this vinegary beverage while on the march. He did so alongside his ordinary, utterly exhausted infantrymen. This greatly boosted the troops' morale and demonstrated the commander's complete unity with his men. Moreover, drinking undiluted wine during a military campaign was strictly prohibited by disciplinary regulations. A drunk legionnaire was a direct threat to the security of the entire Roman battle line. Of course, the supplies that the soldiers carried on their backs would sooner or later come to an inevitable end. That is when special armed detachments of experienced foragers immediately stepped in. They spread out across the surrounding areas in search of any fresh food for the massive army. This was not chaotic looting. It was a systematic and ruthless process of seizing resources from the local population. Soldiers methodically took grain, livestock, and carts, often leaving local residents with only pitiful scraps to survive on. If a village resisted the requisition, it was burned to the ground to teach a harsh lesson to all the other neighbors. Working with pack animals required army quartermasters to possess specialized, highly specific, and in-depth knowledge. A healthy mule could carry up to 100 kilograms of cargo on its back. However, their hooves wore down incredibly quickly on the rough and rocky Roman roads. That is why engineers invented hippos andals, special iron plates fitted over the hooves. These were securely fastened with sturdy leather straps and provided excellent protection for the animal's feet. This allowed the mules to travel along paved roads just as quickly as the armored soldiers themselves. The cooking process was strictly regulated and took place inside small soldiers' quarters. Each 8-person contingent received its share of hard grain. These men had to turn it into tasty, edible food on their own. After an exhausting march, the soldiers would take out their hand mills and begin slowly grinding the wheat into flour. Congratulations, you've just completed another grueling arm workout without even realizing it. From the resulting flour, they baked hard flatbreads over coals or cooked a thick and very nutritious porridge. To ensure the strategic logistics of such campaigns, the empire built reliable warehouses along the troops' route in advance. When the Senate planned a large-scale war, preparations for the logistics bases began a year before the legions set out. In key cities, huge stockpiles of grain, spare weapons, and thousands of liters of sour wine were secretly accumulated. The army moved from one such hub to another, much like a modern car refueling at gas stations. The enemy often could not fathom where the Romans got their endless supply of food in the middle of the scorched and empty steppe. And the secret was simple. They had prepared their supplies back when the barbarians hadn't even thought of war. In the end, victory in the Roman campaign was forged not on the battlefield, but in the quartermaster's ledgers. The ability to feed 50,000 men anywhere in the known world made the legions an unstoppable force. While enemies scattered to their homes due to starvation, the Romans could sit under siege for years. They simply continued to methodically chew their flatbread and wait for the enemy to make a foolish mistake. It was a tedious, mathematically precise killing machine that ground down enemies along with the grain. Logistics may not look cinematic, but it was precisely this that built the longest-lasting empire in history. After a 30-kilometer march with a heavy backpack, most normal people would simply collapse into sleep. Roman soldiers didn't have that luxury, for they would drop their packs, pick up shovels, and start digging. Every night, without a single exception, on any terrain, the Legion built a fully fortified military camp. They erected walls, even if they were in friendly territory or planned to leave early the next morning. This rule was written in the blood of thousands of legionnaires who had died during sudden nighttime attacks in the past. Safety while sleeping was valued above the complaints of exhausted soldiers whose muscles ached with pain. Discipline in the Roman army came first and brooked no excuses. Commanders couldn't care less about pouring rain, the scorching sun, or the biting cold wind. Legionnaires methodically chopped down trees, dug into the hard ground, and hauled heavy stones to fortify the perimeter. All this massive work began immediately upon arrival at the site of the future encampment without the slightest rest. Refusal to work or blatant slacking off was punished with brutal corporal punishment, including being beaten to death with sticks. Therefore, every soldier pushed himself to the limits of his physical capabilities for the common good. The psychological effect of being behind strong walls was incredibly important for the infantry's morale. When you sleep in the open field, any rustle in the bushes makes you jump up and grab your cold sword. In a fortified camp, a soldier knew he was protected by a deep moat, a sharp wooden wall, and sentries. This ensured deep, restorative sleep, which is critically necessary after the most grueling physical exertion. Enemy armies often stayed awake all night, anxiously awaiting an attack, while the Romans snored peacefully in their tents. In the morning, a fresh killing machine took to the battlefield against a sleep-deprived and nervous mob of savages. The lives of ancient tribes differed greatly from the finely tuned military machine of a vast empire. Barbarians set up their camps in a completely chaotic manner, guided only by the presence of clean water and firewood nearby. They had no strict system of sentries, and fortifications were built only in the event of a clear and imminent threat. Because of this, nighttime raids and sabotage often resulted in heavy losses among the Gauls or Germans. The Romans were well aware of this weakness in their enemies and regularly launched nighttime raids on sleeping camps. Thanks to their sturdy walls, they themselves never gave the enemy a chance to retaliate in kind. To build such fortifications daily, every soldier carried a special engineering kit. It included a pickaxe, a shovel, a basket for carrying earth, and 2 wooden stakes with pointed ends. These stakes were tied together to form an impenetrable palisade atop the earthen rampart. Imagine the scene: 50,000 men simultaneously driving 100,000 stakes into freshly dug earth. It was a stunning display of synchronized manual labor, perfected through thousands of daily repetitions until it became second nature. What a modern construction crew would take a whole week to accomplish. An experienced legion completed in a couple of hours before sunset. The process of creating a defensive perimeter always began with digging a deep, properly shaped trench. The earth from this trench was not simply discarded, but carefully carried in woven baskets to the inner side. From this earth, a high and dense rampart was formed, which became a reliable foundation for the wooden palisade. This design brilliantly solved the problem of defense, creating an insurmountable obstacle for the enemy's infantry and cavalry. The enemy first had to descend into a deep pit and then scramble up a sheer earthen wall under a hail of javelins. Overcoming such a barrier without heavy siege equipment was practically impossible. The layout of such a camp was always absolutely identical, regardless of its exact location. In the very center, a spacious tent for the commander was pitched, and perfectly straight, wide streets radiated out from it. Every maniple and every cohort knew exactly where their permanent place was on this gigantic, marked-out grid of tents. If a combat alert was sounded at night, a soldier would run outside and, with his eyes closed, find his position on the wall. No panic, no running about in pitch darkness, only cold order and instant readiness to kill the enemy. To the barbarians, this precise square geometry in the middle of a wild forest looked like the intervention of alien civilizations. The camp's internal layout was striking in its sophistication, an incredible resemblance to a real city. There was a main wide street, a small square for gatherings, and special areas for religious ceremonies. An altar was always located near the commander's tent, where priests offered sacrifices to the gods before important battles. There were also field forges within the perimeter for repairing weapons and hospitals for wounded legionnaires. It was a completely self-sufficient system, capable of functioning in total isolation from the rest of the world. Soldiers felt confident anywhere on the globe, simply because they always carried this order with them. Setting up camp burned approximately 800 extra calories for each soldier involved. It sounds like a form of torture, but it was precisely this daily routine that forged the phenomenal endurance of the Roman heavy infantry. Modern trainers call this an increase in work capacity and the body's ability to perform grueling work for long periods. A legionary's body adapted to the point where digging a deep trench became nothing more than a light warm-up before tomorrow's bloody battle. They could perform enormous amounts of physical exertion without feeling at all that their bodies were on the verge of collapsing from exhaustion. The Romans practiced intense CrossFit long before it became a trend in modern fitness centers. In addition to physical training, the heavy, monotonous labor served the vital function of maintaining the strictest discipline. Commanders understood perfectly well that an idle soldier quickly grows bored, seeks out cheap wine, and begins to think about mutiny. Daily construction work exhausted the legionnaires so thoroughly that they simply had no energy left for foolishness or conflict. In the evening, all they wanted was to eat their field rations and fall into a deep sleep until the first rays of the sun. Such a workload made the army incredibly obedient and manageable, even under the harshest climatic conditions. Physical labor transformed aggressive and dangerous men into a single, reliable instrument of the imperial will. For their numerous enemies, the sight of a Roman camp being built before their very eyes was a source of endless frustration. The Gauls or Germans might pursue a legion all day, desperately hoping to attack it during its nightly rest, but by evening they would see before them sheer walls, watchtowers, and moats that made an assault pure suicide. The enemies could only shout helplessly from the dark forest, watching as the Romans calmly cooked their wheat porridge. This cunning tactic completely deprived the enemy of its main advantage, the element of surprise. The empire ruthlessly imposed its own rules of engagement, forcing its enemies to fight only during the day and only in open terrain. In the morning, the process was repeated in reverse, with the same terrifying and relentless military efficiency. At the sound of the trumpet, the tents were instantly folded up, the fires were extinguished, and the pack mules were loaded with their heavy share of cargo. It was impossible to leave the camp completely intact, lest a cunning enemy be able to use the ready-made fortifications to their advantage. Therefore, before departing, the legionnaires would often set fire to the wooden elements and fill in part of the deep trench they had dug. This seems like a senseless waste of precious resources, but in the military logic of Rome, there was no room for laziness or dangerous compromises. Leaving a good fortification for the enemy meant guaranteeing a death sentence for the comrades who would follow that route after you. This entire system was a perfect example of what is known today as progressive overload training. When you swing a heavy pickaxe and haul stones every day, your trusty sword feels as light as a feather. In close combat, Roman soldiers could deliver slashing and thrusting blows for hours, while their enemies were exhausted after 10 minutes. Their well-trained muscles, accustomed to moving tons of earth, simply didn't notice the resistance of human flesh and wooden shields. Train hard so that real combat is easy. The Romans elevated this banal truth to an absolute cult, and this brutal cult brought them resounding victories throughout long and incredibly bloody centuries. The camp also served as a very reliable shelter from the harsh weather conditions that often proved fatal to other ancient armies. Leather tents called contubernia provided excellent protection against the biting, icy wind, snow, and torrential rain. Inside, the breath of 8 strong men kept the tent warm, while outside, the storm raged, paralyzing enemy forces. Medics strictly ensured that latrines were dug far from drinking water sources and main food storage areas. Thanks to this basic sanitation, the Romans suffered from dysentery far less often than their less hygienic forest neighbors. Survival in the ancient world often depended not on the thickness of iron armor, but on the simple ability to wash one's hands before eating. Ultimately, the Roman fortified camp became the primary symbol of imperial order in a sea of barbarian chaos. It was a small, portable Rome that the legionaries rebuilt every evening from mud and sticks. It demonstrated to everyone around that civilization had come to these lands and had no intention of leaving. Local tribes looked at these neat squares of walls and realized that resistance was utterly futile. The logistical machine for reshaping the landscape worked flawlessly, transforming any wild wasteland into a part of the empire. Most of history's grand battles were won or lost long before they officially began. While commanders delivered rousing speeches before their ranks, the outcome of the battle had already been determined by the mathematics of logistics. If your army is well fed, rested, and armed to the teeth, while the enemy is hungry and exhausted, tactics take a back seat. The Romans understood this principle perfectly and did everything they could to engage the enemy under the most favorable conditions. They weren't looking for a fair, sporting contest. They were looking for an opportunity to crush the enemy with minimal losses. Their main weapon wasn't the famous short sword, but the quartermaster's notebook with precise calculations. Communications and reconnaissance on the march operated with such speed that they seemed like magic to the uninitiated barbarians. Special mounted units constantly scoured the terrain dozens of kilometers ahead of the main advancing infantry column. They gathered data on the terrain, the availability of water, and the moods of local tribes, immediately dispatching couriers back. The commander always had an up-to-date picture of the situation and could change the route on the fly. If a major ambush was detected ahead, the legion did not panic but methodically reorganized to destroy it. Managing a huge mass of people without radio communication required incredible coordination and nerves of steel. A corps of professional military engineers and craftsmen played a huge role in this mobile system. Each legion had its own blacksmiths, carpenters, armorers, and even specialists in ballistics and catapults. If carts broke down or swords became dull during the march, everything was repaired that evening, right at the campsite. Engineers could assemble a siege tower from cut timber in literally just a few days before the start of a city assault. The Roman army was a completely self-sufficient enterprise that carried its own factories and workshops on its own backs. They did not wait for weapons shipments from the capital. They produced death on an industrial scale, right there on the spot. The standardization of equipment was another ingenious solution that radically simplified the empire's logistics. A nail for sandals, forged in Egypt, fit perfectly into the footwear of a soldier serving in distant Britain. Shields, armor, and spearheads were produced according to uniform, approved blueprints at massive state-run factories. If a unit lost part of its equipment after a battle, it could be instantly replaced from warehouses. Modern armies only adopted the concept of a single cartridge and standardized spare parts in the 20th century. The ancient Romans implemented this approach millennia ago, ensuring the smooth operation of their military machine. Medical support on the march saved thousands of lives and helped maintain the strength of the trained legions. Wagons carrying field surgeons, bandages, and instruments for emergency operations always moved in the rearguard. Roman doctors knew how to stop arterial bleeding, suture wounds, and even perform complex amputations. They used boiling water to sterilize instruments, intuitively understanding the principles of antiseptics without microscopes. A wounded soldier knew he would not be left to die in a ditch, but that they would try to heal him and return him to duty. This incredibly boosted morale and compelled men to fight with fanatical devotion to their legion. Replacing fallen soldiers happened with a speed and methodicalness that terrified the enemy. If a legion lost 1,000 men in battle, couriers immediately rushed to the training camps for fresh recruits. The logistics system ensured their rapid delivery to the front lines via those very same stone roads. The enemy might celebrate a local victory, hoping that the Romans were bled dry and would soon retreat home. But a month later, they were once again faced with a fully manned legion, ready to continue the bloody slaughter. This ability to replenish losses drove even the most tenacious and talented commanders of antiquity to despair. Managing 50,000 aggressive men required an incredibly complex bureaucracy and accounting system. Scribes worked constantly in the camp, recording grain expenditures, salary payments, and lists of the dead. All this paperwork or, more precisely, parchment red tape, was the hidden engine of Roman military successes on the continent. You can't just tell a crowd, go there and win. You need to calculate exactly how much they'll eat along the way. Bureaucracy is often seen as synonymous with inefficiency, but in the Roman army, it was the foundation of order and discipline. Every denarius and every kilogram of wheat was accounted for, which prevented widespread theft and starvation. Of course, maintaining such a well-oiled machine cost an astronomical sum. For an ancient state budget, military expenditures sometimes consumed up to 70% of all tax revenues in the vast empire. Legionnaires were paid in silver. They had to be fed, clothed, and provided with a pension after retirement. Rome's economy literally worked to keep these marching machines in constant motion. It was a vicious cycle. The army needed money to conquer new lands, and new lands were needed to pay the army. It was impossible to stop, or else this entire gigantic financial pyramid would have collapsed instantly. Ultimately, it was the sheer size of the logistics network that became one of the reasons for the fall of the western part of the empire. When the borders stretched from Scotland to Iraq, the distances became too great even for Roman roads. Troop movements took months, and crises on the frontiers flared up faster than the legions could reach them. A machine designed for local conquests simply overheated from attempts to control the entire known world. The logistics that made Rome great ultimately could not withstand its own incredible scale and ambitions. But how long it lasted remains the greatest miracle of engineering and organizational thought. The legacy of this system lives on in the operating principles of today's major corporations and armies around the world. The concepts of supply chains, standardized components, and forced marches were born right there in the dust of Roman roads. When you receive a package the day after you order it, remember that the foundations of this logistics were laid by people in tunics. They proved that organization, discipline, and tedious calculations always triumph over brute force and disorganized enthusiasm. The Roman legions are long gone, but their invisible supply machine has forever changed the way the world works. The history of Roman marches is not just a story about how tough guys walked a lot. It is a perfect example of how boring and routine processes determine the fate of entire civilizations for centuries. It is not the loudest, the most handsome, or even the bravest warrior with a huge axe who wins. The system that wins is the one that can consistently feed its people, provide them with safe shelter, and deliver arrows on time. The Romans built an empire not because their gods were stronger, but because their logistics were flawless. It doesn't sound very cinematic, and Hollywood rarely makes movies about Roman quartermasters and accountants. It's far more exciting to show gleaming armor, gladiatorial battles, and grand speeches before a crowd of thousands of soldiers. But now, when you see a marching legion in the movies, you'll know their greatest and most terrifying secret. Behind every gleaming sword lay hours of hard labor with a shovel, calluses from sandals, and meticulous accounting of wheat. That is precisely what made them invincible, and, to be honest, it is far more impressive than any Hollywood fairy tale.